6 o'clock news. The South African government has redoubled its efforts to enforce pass laws of the cities. All those Bantu considered redundant will be reincorporated into the reserves, where they can enjoy a lifestyle of subsistence farming in the traditional manner. In the news today, the nation faces a crisis as General Herzog opposes South Africa's participation in the war against Germany. Many Africans have pledged their allegiance to the Allied cause, but will not be allowed to bear arms lest they turn their guns on their superiors. In the news today, 20,000 people living in the Johannesburg area have elected to walk to work instead of using the municipal bus services. This in reaction to a recent fare increase. Government has responded with promises of tough action. Under no circumstances can walkers be tolerated in the streets of Johannesburg. In further news, government has issued a warning about the dangers of jazz and Marabi dance in the townships. According to a government spokesman, Marabi-style gatherings have a negative effect on public morals, encouraging alcohol consumption, racial mixing, and other forms of inappropriate behaviour. In the news today, more than 60,000 mine workers downed tools in protest against low wages and poor working conditions in South African mines. Government has responded with a series of raids on left-wing organisations and newspapers. In the news today, the National Party government has won the election with a mandate to remove coloured voters from the Cape voters' roll. The move has been welcomed by various groups, particularly because it places coloured voters on an equal footing with Africans who were removed from the roll in 1936.
So from that irreverent history, I turn to the history that I explore in my book, World of Letters. The focus for this book is also on the early 20th century. So the broader context, in terms of the broader context, we look at the impact of events such as the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, the Second World War, but in South Africa in particular, the shift from the policy of racial segregation under the United Party to formalised apartheid under the National Party. So I'm engaging with that history, but I wanted to look at that history from a very specific vantage point, and that is from the perspective of the public sphere. So from the perspective of newspapers and magazines, the perspective of public discussion. And my background in English studies makes me particularly partial to the public discussion of culture and literature. So what does the public debate about literature and culture tell us? What can it reveal about a particular society of the early 20th century? So my project took place very much as a form of historical recovery and retrieval. It was an attempt to assemble the fragments and the shards of these discussions into some kind of coherent trajectory. My interest was in marginal voices, in recovering ephemeral intellectual encounters and hidden debates. And to do that, I focused on a number of periodicals, a number of journals and magazines from the period. The first one I looked at was called the South African Opinion. That was a journal which arose in the late 1930s. It was based in Johannesburg. It was edited, well, its literary editor, and I'm particularly interested in that, its literary editor was Herbert Charles Bosman, and it was also the first publication in which South African writers and authors were encouraged to publish. The second publication I looked at is Trek magazine, which is up on the screen. Trek magazine achieved notoriety in the early part of the Second World War because of its controversial left-wing take on political and cultural affairs, and was also noteworthy for the presence of such a terrible, kind of unheard of thing as a Marxist literary critic, Dora Taylor, who was writing articles on literary content in that periodical. I was also interested in a whole range of periodicals which clustered around the Communist Party of South Africa. So there was The Guardian and all its successor publications such as New Age and Spark. So that was also a particular focus. Then also in the 50s, Fighting Talk, which was a magazine to which a lot of communists were drawn in the 50s because communists had been ban that organization had gone underground. So I looked at Fighting Talk, which was edited by Ruth First. Then also a number of publications which were associated with an organization known as the Non-European Unity Movement. The Non-European Unity Movement was an organization founded in the early 1940s, and its politics had some affiliations with left-wing perspectives, but it defined itself in opposition to the ANC. So it was oppositional, but so I looked at the Voice, for instance, and the Citizen as examples of another kind of debate. And then finally, a very interesting publication which arose in the Orlando Township. It was edited by a number of different people, including Eskia Lele, who made a name for himself as the satirical columnist of a column called Rabelais and His World, and was this kind of irreverent alter ego figure that became well known. So these were the kinds of things that I looked at. I tended to focus on articles and book reviews as rich sources for my work, but I was also very interested in the letters pages, and letters pages became really such a valuable source for me because for some, well, I mean, it sort of seems surprising now, but there were these long, complex, often very hostile, acrimonious debates about all things, books and literature. So letters pages were also very, very important. So what is disclosed by this history? Well, the first point I wanted to make is just the sheer diversity, the sheer vibrancy of the public sphere during the 1940s and 50s period. So many publications emerged, so many small, independent, non-commercial publications are there in that period. Perhaps something to do with the absence of television, I don't know, but it was really a vibrant time for the public sphere. Not only magazines and publications, but also, the debating societies and book clubs and so on. There was a really strong sense of the importance of discussion and debate in that social context. So this proliferation of publication, but also a very rich and very lively public debate about literature and culture. And what was striking about that debate was that it occurred beyond the bounds of the university, so way beyond the sort of authorized spaces of the university. There was this debate about culture and literature amongst ordinary people, so it drew in a popular audience, and it had very little to do with what was going on in the universities at that time. So my question was to ask, what is the nature of the cultural debates that emerged in these communities? What were people discussing? What were the issues of the day? Then also what was intriguing for me was what books were circulating in those reading communities. What were people reading? And then maybe more interesting, what were they doing with those books? How were they reading them? How were they interpreting them? And I think I just want to make one main point about this history, and that is what was so fascinating to me was the way in which the critics and readers and people who are participating in these debates understood the cultural domain and the political domain as richly intertwined. So they didn't see them as separate, they saw them as deeply enmeshed and entangled. So what I wanted to foreground in my argument was the centrality of culture in political discussion. So people used culture in order to make political plays. People used cultural debate in order to fashion political demands and forms of resistance. So really what I wanted to emphasize was the importance of culture for our political history. And that's the kind of main point that I wanted to make. So just in the closing minutes, what I wanted to do is just to point out some of the connections between politics and culture that were explored. And the first was to do the reading of literary texts. So as one would expect, perhaps in these politicized communities, texts were read for their political and sociological content. They were read for the insights that they might offer about the world in which people were living. So they were often read as kind of forms of revelation. If you read this text, you will find out about apartheid oppression, you will find out about police brutality, or you'll find out about capitalist exploitation in the US. So what happened with these discussions is that the literary text is viewed as offering insights into reality, but also the literary text then becomes a springboard for a political debate. It becomes the center around which debates can constellate. So it kind of stimulates this really interesting discussion. So, a whole range of books were discussed in these communities: classic texts, canonical texts, also more local examples, texts from literature from the United States. So Richard Wright's Native Son, for instance, was very important. Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape. All of these texts were brought in and made to speak to South African concerns. They resonated within this context. So what you find in these communities is that the line between literary criticism and political critique starts to become very blurred. That kind of critical exegesis working with the text, but then political demands, political resistance, all becomes connected. And a particularly interesting example of this phenomenon was A.C. Jordan's reading of Shakespeare's The Tempest. A.C. Jordan was a teacher in the Eastern Cape at the time, and he was a member of the Cape African Teachers Association, and he gave a speech which drew on Shakespeare's Tempest. And it's one of the first times in which The Tempest was read as an anti-colonial text. So it's a very interesting moment in South African cultural and political history, where once again these cultural and political aspects are combined, in which he reads the play, particularly as a teacher, as a critique of Western colonial education. And his argument through the dynamics between Caliban and Prospero, his argument is that that Western colonial education produces not necessarily emancipation, but rather willing slaves. So these are some of the examples of how texts were brought into political debate. Of course, not all literary texts were approached with the same enthusiasm. So I had an image of Pride of Love Country a little while earlier. And that was a text which simply in the communities, in the reading communities which clustered around the Torch newspaper, this was a text which was subjected to a great deal of criticism, and a lot of heated debate arose about that text. So what is at stake here is the politics of the text, the way in which the text presented itself as neutral politically, but could also be argued as, and many of the participants did argue, that it was an apology for government policies of retribalization. The other author who was subjected to a lot of hostile criticism, not surprisingly, was Sarah Gertrude Millen. So here we have a kind of discussion which is attuned to instances of racial stereotyping or instances of historical distortion. So they're both, positive and negative responses to these texts. I'm just going to end with, it is here, just end that slide. I'm going to end with another kind of working with the text, which is also very striking, and that is Eskia Patlele, under the guise of his alter ego, Rabelais, who took two canonical texts, two sort of sacrosanct texts, Milton's Paradise Lost and Byron's The Vision of Judgment. And what he did with those was not only to kind of read them against the grain, but also, in fact, to get into those texts and to literally rewrite them. So he refashioned those texts as a way of talking about or offering a satirical perspective on Afrikaner nationalism and the absurdities of the apartheid rule. So any sort of lover of Milton or Byron would be horrified, I'm sure, but there's this wonderful sense of respect for the text and kind of sense of this person as a model and as a hero, but also a kind of defacing of the text, the kind of corruption that occurs. So just to conclude, I think this South African intellectual and cultural traditions are incredibly rich, but so many of them are hidden, so many of them are unexplored. And so my hope was to bring out some of these hidden voices, to open them up to historical inquiry, to bring them into historical memory as a way of offering offering a fuller sense of South African literary criticism, South African literary culture, a fuller sense of what's preceded us, and a fuller sense of our genealogy. Thanks very much.